At least one child isn't a disappointment, my father said, laughing as he pulled my sister into a proud hug. The room applauded. Crystal glasses clinked. Someone snapped a photo. I felt my face burn, but I stayed silent, staring at the table like I always did. This was his birthday dinner, a private room, family everywhere. And somehow, I was still the failure everyone agreed not to mention out loud. I could have swallowed it. I usually did. But instead, I reached into my pocket and touched my phone, because this time staying quiet would cost them far more than my pride. My name is Lydia Morrison, and for most of my life, I've been the quiet disappointment in a family that measures love by applause. I'm in my late 30s now, but in my parents' eyes, I froze somewhere back when I chose the wrong path. While other families talked about happiness, mine talked about resumes, titles, and who sat closest to power. My father, James Morrison, built his reputation the old-fashioned way, long hours, sharp suits, and a belief that success only counts if everyone recognizes it. My mother, Margaret, learned early how to smooth over discomfort with perfect posture and polite smiles. And then there was my sister, Emma, the golden child, the one who followed the script exactly as written. Law school, promotions, the kind of career my parents could brag about at dinner parties without lowering their voices. Growing up, the comparisons were constant but subtle. Emma's achievements were celebrated with framed photos and loud toasts. Mine were acknowledged with nods, if at all. When I chose engineering over law, my father said nothing, just looked at me like I'd stepped off a well-marked road into tall grass. When I started working in technology, my mother told people I was still figuring things out. I learned how to make myself small. I learned how to sit at the far end of the table and finish meals quietly. I learned how to let conversations roll over me like background noise. It wasn't that I lacked ambition. I just stopped sharing it with them. The birthday dinner was supposed to be different, a milestone, a chance for everyone to come together in one room and pretend we were closer than we really were. The private dining room smelled like expensive food and polished wood. Soft music played under the hum of voices. Emma arrived glowing, greeted with hugs before she even sat down. I arrived 5 minutes later and slid into my chair unnoticed. As the night unfolded, stories about my father's career filled the air. Compliments bounced from one relative to another. I watched my mother straighten the candles on the cake, watched Emma laugh easily, watched my father soak it all in, and I felt that familiar tension settle in my chest, the sense that once again I was about to be reminded exactly where I stood. What I didn't know yet was how far they were about to push me. Once the appetizers were cleared, the night shifted. It always did. That was when the comparisons started slipping out disguised as compliments. Emma's latest win came up first. Someone mentioned a promotion. Another relative chimed in about a big case she'd helped close. My father leaned back in his chair, pleased, nodding like every word confirmed something he'd always known. My mother beamed, correcting small details, polishing the story as it passed around the table. And Emma handled it all so gracefully, my aunt said, just like her dad. I watched Emma smile, practiced and modest. She glanced at me for half a second, then looked away. Then the conversation drifted slowly, inevitably toward me. So Lydia, my uncle asked, swirling his drink, "Are you still doing that computer thing?" I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. "I work in technology," I said evenly. "Oh, right," he laughed. "Very modern." My father waved a hand, not even looking at me. "She likes working independently. Some people aren't cut out for traditional careers." There it was, that line, the one that sounded generous until you listened closely, independent, as if it were a consolation prize. Someone else asked if I was still renting that little office downtown. Another wondered if I'd ever thought about switching directions before it was too late. My mother tried to soften it, telling them I was creative and marching to my own beat. I could hear the apology underneath her words. I took a sip of water and stared at the condensation sliding down the glass. I didn't argue. I didn't correct them. I'd learned that explanations only made things worse. In this family, success only counted if it looked familiar. As the praise for Emma grew louder, memories I'd kept tucked away started pushing forward. The time a potential partner backed out after a quiet conversation with my father. The deal that vanished after Emma casually mentioned my work was still experimental. The way doors seemed to close just as I reached for them. Back then, I'd told myself it was coincidence, bad timing, growing pains. Sitting there now listening to my father talk about legacy and reputation, I realized it wasn't coincidence at all. It was protection, just not for me. They'd been protecting the image they understood, even if it meant quietly sabotaging anything that didn't fit it. The room felt smaller with every passing minute. The laughter sounded sharper. My name came up again, this time with a sigh. "You had every advantage," my father said, finally turning to look at me. "Great schools, support, and yet," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I felt something inside me shift. Not anger exactly, something colder, clearer, the kind of calm that comes right before you stop asking for permission. For the first time that night, I met his eyes. And that's when he leaned forward and asked the question he'd been saving all evening, the one meant to put me back in my place. "What do you think went wrong with you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. "What do you think went wrong with you?" For a second, I didn't hear anything else. The hum of the room faded. The clink of silverware stopped. All I could feel was the weight of every time I'd tried to explain myself and been met with that same look, confusion mixed with disappointment, like I'd failed a test everyone else passed without studying. I opened my mouth. Then I closed it. Because suddenly, every answer I'd practiced over the years felt useless. I could have talked about the nights I slept on a couch in my office, the weekends I spent rewriting systems while my friends went to weddings and baby showers. I could have told him about the risks I took, the fear I carried, the way I kept going even when no one clapped. But I knew how it would land. He'd hear excuses. He always did. My mother shifted in her chair. "James," she said softly, the way she did when she wanted peace without choosing sides. "Maybe this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," he replied, eyes still on me. "She needs to be honest with herself." Honest. The word almost made me laugh. I looked around the table, my aunt avoiding my gaze, my uncle suddenly interested in his drink, Emma staring straight ahead, her lips pressed together, saying nothing. She didn't defend me. She never did. She didn't have to. Silence had always worked in her favor. Something inside me finally gave way, not in a dramatic burst, but in a quiet collapse. The part of me that still hoped, still waited for a nod of approval, still believed that if I explained myself just right, they might see me differently. That part went still. In its place came clarity. I realized I'd been answering the wrong question my entire life. It wasn't what went wrong with me, it was, why was I still asking them to understand? I set my napkin on the table and folded it carefully, my hands steady in a way that surprised even me. My father mistook my silence for submission. I could tell. He leaned back, satisfied, as if the conversation had ended exactly where he wanted it. But it hadn't ended. It had shifted. I felt the outline of my phone against my leg, heavy and familiar. I'd carried it through countless dinners like this, through holidays and birthdays and awkward reunions. I'd never planned to use it here. Not really. Part of me had hoped I wouldn't need to. I glanced at Emma. For the first time, she looked uneasy, like she sensed something changing but couldn't quite name it. My father cleared his throat, ready to move on to toast, to laugh, to seal the moment. That was when I stood up, slowly, calmly, not to argue, not to defend myself, but to stop pretending I still needed their permission to exist. When I stood up, the chair legs scraped softly against the floor. The sound cut through the room sharper than any raised voice. My father paused mid-sentence, his glass still lifted. He looked at me the way you look at someone who's just broken an unspoken rule. "Sit down, Lydia," he said, already smiling again as if this was a small interruption he could smooth over. "We're about to toast." I didn't sit. I didn't raise my voice either. That was the part that unsettled them first. "I just have a question," I said, my hands resting lightly on the back of the chair. "Before we move on." My mother inhaled quickly. "Lydia, please. This is your father's birthday." "I know," I said. "That's why I want to say this now." Emma shifted in her seat. She finally looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time that night, her expression wasn't polished. It was cautious. My father tilted his head. "Go on." I glanced around the table, at the faces that had watched me shrink for years, at the relatives who had laughed at jokes made at my expense and called it honesty, at my mother who had perfected the art of silence, at Emma who had benefited from all of it without ever asking why. "You asked what went wrong with me," I said calmly. "I think it's only fair you hear the answer." He scoffed lightly. "This isn't the place for 'I disagree.'" The room fell quiet. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. No dramatic flourish, no shaking hands, just one smooth motion. I unlocked the screen, tapped twice, and turned it toward the center of the table. "I never told you because none of you ever wanted to know," I continued. "But since we're talking about disappointment, let's talk about facts." The screen glowed softly under the chandelier. Numbers, clean, simple. A balance rounded to the nearest million. Someone sucked in a sharp breath. My aunt leaned forward, squinting. "Is that?" My father's smile froze. "That can't be right." I slid the phone a little closer so everyone could see. "That's one account," I said. "Personal." The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was heavy, dense, like the air before a storm breaks. Emma's face went pale. "Lydia," she whispered, "what is this?" This, I said, meeting her eyes, is what happens when you stop trying to impress people who already decided who you are. My father let out a short laugh, brittle and disbelieving. "You expect us to believe you just have that kind of money sitting around?" "No," I said. "I expect you to recognize it. Because you've heard of the work, just not my name." I tapped the screen again, opening a simple valuation summary. No technical jargon, just the numbers that mattered. "My company operates in artificial intelligence," I said evenly. "We build systems used in finance, healthcare, and logistics. Quiet industries. Serious ones. The kind that don't need dinner party bragging." My mother sank back into her chair. Her hand trembled as she reached for her glass. "That valuation," I continued, "is several billion. Conservative estimate." A fork clattered onto a plate. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." Emma shook her head, already pulling out her phone, fingers moving too fast. "This doesn't make sense. If that were true, we would have known." I smiled just slightly. "You would have had to listen." My father stood up abruptly, his chair tipping back before he caught it. "You're lying," he said, but there was no conviction behind the word. "This is some kind of stunt, some app, some fake report." I waited until he finished. Then I said, "Remember when the Hamiltons asked you about investing in a tech venture a few years ago?" My mother's eyes widened. "You told them not to waste their money," I went on. "You said I wasn't ready, that it was a risk to your reputation." He opened his mouth, closed it again. "They invested anyway," I said quietly. "Just not through you. Their returns multiplied. Fast." Emma looked up from her phone, her face drained of color. "Lydia, the company they're talking about in these articles, that's you." I nodded. The room erupted in overlapping voices. "Why didn't you say anything? How long has this been going on? This is unbelievable." My father slammed his hand on the table. "Enough," he snapped. "If you've been successful, fine. Congratulations. But humiliating us like this?" On my birthday, I tilted my head. "Humiliating," he gestured wildly. "You sit there for years letting us think. Think what I cut," in my voice still steady, "that I was struggling, that I was lost." "You didn't think. You assumed." My mother reached for my arm. "Honey, you should have told us. We could have helped. Introduced you to the right people." I gently pulled my arm back. "You tried," I said. "You just helped in the opposite direction." Silence again. "I didn't build what I built because of this family," I said. "I built it despite this family, despite being told over and over that what I did wasn't real, that it didn't count." My father stared at me, something unfamiliar flickering behind his eyes. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. "You wanted to talk about legacy," I continued, "about making the Morrison name mean something. Well, it does, just not in the way you planned." I picked up my phone, slipped it back into my pocket, and finally looked directly at him. "Happy birthday," I said. "Here's my gift." He swallowed. "What gift?" "The truth." No one spoke. I reached for my coat and draped it over my arm. As I turned to leave, I heard Emma stand up behind me. "Wait!" she said, her voice cracking. "We should talk about this. Just us. There could be opportunities." I paused, then looked back at her. Opportunities only matter when you respect the person attached to them. My father sank back into his chair, the room no longer bending around him the way it always had. I walked out of the private dining room without another word, leaving behind half-finished drinks, a melting cake, and a family forced to confront a truth they'd never prepared for. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small walking away. I felt finished. The hallway outside the dining room felt colder, quieter, like I'd stepped out of a storm and into clean air. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. The door closed behind me, sealing off the voices that were already starting to rise inside. My driver was waiting by the curb. The city lights reflected off the windshield as I slid into the back seat, my coat still folded neatly over my arm. "Home?" he asked. "No," I said after a beat. "The office." As the car pulled away, my phone vibrated once, then again and again. Messages stacked on the screen, my mother asking to talk Emma, saying she hadn't known relatives suddenly eager to reconnect. I didn't open any of them. I turned the screen face down and watched the street blur past. The elevator ride up to the top floors was silent, familiar, grounding. When the doors opened, the quiet hum of work greeted me, the soft sound of systems running lights, low but purposeful. This was the world I'd built. One where I wasn't tolerated or evaluated, but trusted. I set my phone on the desk and finally allowed myself a slow breath. They could keep their apologies. I'd already outgrown the need for them. For years, I thought success meant finally earning my family's approval. That night taught me something different. Real success is knowing your worth, even when the people closest to you refuse to see it. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.